And joining me now is United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk. Mr. Turk, thank you so much for being here. I want to start by getting your reaction to the strike on a hospital Gaza's health ministry says killed hundreds today. Despite the United Nations' repeated warnings to avert what it calls a humanitarian catastrophe, the situation for civilians is becoming increasingly more dire. If the UN's appeals are being ignored, what exactly is the path forward to protect lives?
I mean, it is of the utmost importance, first of all, to respect international humanitarian law in any armed conflict. I mean, it's clear that Israel has legitimate security concerns after what happened 10 days ago, but it is equally clear that once you engage in military conduct, war have rules, and that is international humanitarian law. And that means the principle of distinction, meaning you have to make a distinction between civilian and military objects, principle of proportionality, and the principle of precaution. And that's paramount in this type of situations. And it's not just for Israel, it's also for all the Palestinian armed groups that are engaged in this conflict.
Now, your office said today that Israel's evacuation order to 1 million Gazans from the north to move to the south could be in breach of international law because it could amount to a forcible transfer of civilians. What caused you to make that declaration today, and how do you determine if there is actually a breach under international law?
Well, as you remember, last week there was an evacuation order that should be done within 24 hours. The UN made a call to rescind that order because it is simply impossible to evacuate over a million civilians within 24 hours. So when you actually declare a certain area for a temporary evacuation, you need to make sure that these people can go somewhere, have access to food, have shelter, have access to water, combined with the so-called complete siege of Gaza. It's impossible to ensure that this is being done. And as we know, the UN has supplies waiting on the Egyptian border to come into the Gaza Strip. So the combination of all of this raises very serious concerns from an international humanitarian law perspective, including from the perspective that it could be forced transfer.
But how do you go about determining if there is an actual breach?
Well, this is always very complicated because one needs to look at the different circumstances. But what we did today is issue a warning that if the principles are not respected, that it could lead to this evaluation that it is a forced transfer. And for us, it's important when we see certain signals appear to be clear about what the international humanitarian law has to say.
Do you feel those principles are being respected currently?
I'm very worried that they are not. I mean, look at what Hamas did. They abducted, as we understand, 199 people and take them hostage. There were even discussions about bargaining chips. People should never be bargaining chips. There are indiscriminately fired projectiles into Israel. At the same time, what we see on the Israeli side is the bombardment of civilian infrastructure, and which has led to the killings of, well, we don't know exactly the number, but certainly almost 3,000 people already. What we see is the blockade around Gaza and the fact that humanitarian assistance cannot come in. Obviously, the message is to all parties, respect international humanitarian law, because if you don't, it will have consequences, and it must have consequences from an accountability perspective to all parties to the conflict.
We know that electricity, food, and water are scarce. Backup generators at hospitals are running low on fuel. Aid can't get in. What do you fear as the worst case scenario?
I mean, that people will die, that especially the ones that are most vulnerable, because if you don't have water, or if you don't have safe drinking water, or if you don't get the medical supplies that you need, can you imagine if you depend on medical supplies, and if these medical supplies run out, if children are no longer nourished in an appropriate way, it means that this has an incredible negative, precarious impact on the most vulnerable people. And And that's terrible. Let's bring it back to the human level. And I want to say something, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed 75 years ago, made one thing very clear, that each and every one of us is equal in dignity and rights, irrespective of who we are. And especially when it comes to to conflict situations, we need to bear this very much in mind. And it's not the Israeli and the Palestinian lives of civilians are equally protected, and we need to put that perspective forward. It's about civilians here.
Give us a sense of the scope of this.
If you think that it is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, with 2.2 million people crammed into a very, very stretched area of land, with now the evacuation order that has been issued, with people moving into the south but not finding accommodation there, some of them going back to the north. I mean, I cannot even imagine what it must feel like to be a Palestinian child now in Gaza, or someone who is caught up in who is in a hospital bed somewhere where the doctors don't know whether they will have the supplies anymore. I can't even fathom what it means for the mothers who are there not knowing where they are gonna sleep the next night, or where to get the drinking water that they need for their babies. There are 50,000 pregnant women in the Gaza Strip. I don't even want to imagine how they feel. It's terrible. So of course, this type of situations have a catastrophic impact on civilians, on people who are in the most vulnerable situation, and it is imperative that humanitarian assistance gets into Gaza so that people can be protected and assisted.
Israel says it will consider a mechanism for allowing aid to enter if there are guarantees Hamas militants won't seize any deliveries and if Hamas releases the hostages. What do you think of those conditions?
I mean, it's clear that when it comes to people, they cannot be bargaining chips on both sides. International humanitarian law is clear. You need to provide, and you need to make sure that food, fuel, water, medical supplies are provided to a civilian population, to a much beleaguered civilian population that is in distress. That's the obligation.
Now, as this crisis intensifies, there is another in Sudan. 300,000 Sudanese have fled their country's war and are now into Egypt facing an economic crisis. How is that crisis shaping how Egypt sees the crisis in the Middle East? Does that country even have the capacity to take more people in?
I mean, Egypt is in an extremely dire situation. First of all, because of its own economic conditions. There have been many negotiations now also on the austerity measures. It affects the population considerably. They have just had, as you mentioned, an influx of over 300,000 Sudanese refugees in addition to already 2 to 3 million Sudanese who are living on the territory. They have had a lot of Libyans who have gone through. They have Syrian refugee populations. So it is clear that the country faces a myriad of challenges, and certainly the situation in the Gaza Strip is not at all one that they. I mean, it just is an additional massive challenge for the country. By the way, on Sudan, there are actually 1 million refugees in Chad, so it shows already what the Sudanese conflict and that war has in terms of implications. 9,000 people died according to our own verifications, probably many more.
Today is your first anniversary as the United Nations Human Rights Chief. You've been to Sudan, to Ukraine, to Haiti, and are having to deal with multiple flashpoints. Is there a common thread you've noticed?
I mean, we need to be aware of where these crises start. And they start with the neglect, with the violation, and with the indifference when it comes to the human rights of each and every one of us. Because it's inequalities that drive grievances. It's actually the indifference or the lack of care for the other and the dehumanization of the other that drives conflict and violence. And it is also the fact that we don't see the other anymore as the other that actually leads to conflict and all kinds of ills that the world is facing. So my strong message is go back to the base, which is the human rights cause. 75 years ago, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed. Also, in very dark times, Europe and the world just came out of 2 world wars, 60 million people displaced in Europe alone. Just imagine that. But the world had faced the Holocaust, atrocity crimes, and an incredibly precarious economic and social situation. So out of this came this never again sentiment after the Second World War, and the realization that human rights are the motor of change and getting us away from the abyss of war and human rights violations. So I can only ask everyone to go back to that origin and to see what it means in our lives today, including in relation to the present and future challenges. And that's incredibly important, that we are again inspired by the human rights that were so painstakingly developed in the wake of cataclysmic events. We are going through a very turbulent and uncertain time today, but we have the force and we have the law that helps us be the best guide when crisis hits us.
How do you think people should be guarding against misinformation and disinformation in these uncertain times?
I mean, it is absolutely critical that we need independent media outlets. We also need guardrails when it comes to social media platforms, especially when they incite violence, when they are used to incite or amplifying incitement to violence or hatred or harmful disinformation. We saw it during the COVID pandemic. There was so much misinformation going on that actually harmed people. And we need to learn the lessons from it. We see it also in our democratic processes where candidates are vilified with utter nonsense sometimes. And we don't even realize how much this erodes the foundations of our societies and the cohesion, the social cohesion that exists. So we really need to work very hard on making sure that social media platforms have human rights due diligence responsibilities, that misinformation, harmful misinformation is a no-go, and that incitement to violence and hatred is banned.
Do you think the tech giants have provided adequate guardrails?
I mean, first of all, we have been in discussions with all the big social media platforms. And you probably know last year I issued even an open letter to Elon Musk when he took over Twitter at the time, because he had just fired the human rights team, and we wanted to get in touch with them because of a very concerning situation in a particular country context. When we called, no one picked up the phone because they had just been fired. So we know that self-regulation is not going to work. We will need regulatory agreements to make sure that social media platforms cannot be used in a harmful way and in a way that incites to violence, to hatred, or spreads utter harmful disinformation. So that's still a long way to go. We have seen developments in Europe where this has been regulated, but we cannot only rely on self-regulation by big companies.